Welcome to the 2022 DiLCo Lecture Series on Digital Language and Communication. I am Yannis Androutopoulos from the University of Hamburg. DiLCo is a 3-year scientific network on digital language variation in context, initiated in 2021. It is coordinated from Hamburg by my colleague Heike Zinsmeister and myself, and currently includes scholars from universities in the US, UK, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, and Denmark. DiLCo is generously supported by the University of Hamburg within the Universities of Excellence scheme funded by the German federal government and the federal states. DiLCo aims to stimulate scientific exchange between various approaches to digital language and communication research within linguistics and to bridge gaps between qualitative and quantitative computational research methods. To this purpose, we are organizing online and on-site activities such as conference panels, methods workshops, and this DiLCo Lecture Series. Our lectures showcase cutting-edge international research by senior and younger scholars who draw on key concepts in sociocultural linguistics to shed light on language variation and change in digital communication. We are recording these lectures to build up a repository that is available open access from Hamburg University's video portal called Lecture to Go. Please visit our website for more information. Each lecture is about 40 to 45 minutes, followed by discussion. Feel free to post questions and comments into the chat during the lecture. It is now with much pleasure that I introduce today's speaker, Jack Grieve. Jack is a professor of corpus linguistics at the University of Birmingham. He is also a Turing Fellow at the Alan Turing Institute in London and a member of the Institute for Interdisciplinary Data Science and AI and of the Center of Corpus Research, both at Birmingham. Jack's research focuses on language variation and change in English, in different varieties of English, based on the computational analysis of large corpora of natural language. He is author of the monograph Regional Variation in Written American English, published in 2016, and of a large number of papers on a wide range of topics, including theory and methodology in empirical linguistics, as well as authorship attribution analysis. Jack is one of the key researchers in computational sociolinguistics and has contributed several very well-known and influential publications on, among other topics, regional language variation in Twitter data, stylistic variation on the Donald Trump Twitter account, a fabulous paper, I thought, co-authored with Isabel Clark, lexical innovation, lexical emergence, abusive language, and the graphical representation of phonological dialect features in social media, a key topic in the DiLCo network. Today, Jack will talk to us about a recent project of his, and the title of his talk is In Search of Double Modals. Thank you for being with us, Jack, and the floor is now yours.
Thank you, Yannis. Let me share here. Great, everyone can see that? Perfect. Okay, great. So, so today I'm going to talk about the research we've been doing on double modals. This is research that has been done with Cameron Morin, who's a PhD student. He's in Lyon now. And this is work that was actually first kind of initially reported like, 6, 7, 8 years ago at NWave in Toronto. And then what happened was it kind of just got backburnered. And then at some point, Cameron contacted me and said, can we start working with this Twitter data? And I said, sure. And so we started working on it again. And we found a lot of kind of new results there, or sort of, we're able to develop it a lot and I think make some pretty interesting contributions. I think it's also a really good illustration in hindsight of sort of the value of computational sociolinguistics. So let me just quickly introduce that idea. I'm going to kind of bookend the talk by kind of zooming out to computational linguistics and then kind of coming back to that at the end. So basically, to me, computational sociolinguistics is really just the study of language variation and change using big data, generally harvested online, or essentially always harvested online, because when we're talking about these really large data sets, that's kind of the only place you can get them. They come from two basic sources, I think, right now. The one are these like large natural language corpora, like the kind of stuff that I'm going to talk about today. But the other one is these sort of big online surveys that people do, right? And so they do these big dialect surveys and they do them online. And the great advantage of this kind of approach is that you get a huge amount of data back, and you get, I think, especially when we're talking about these large corpora, you get data back, in amounts that you could never get back in any other source. But I think the survey stuff gives a good example of kind of the advantage that you could do this huge survey, let's say, like you could go around to thousands of locations and interview people, and people have done this, right, in, say, American dialectology, or German dialectology for that matter. But in American dialectology, you know, in like hundreds of years, only a couple of these were ever completed. And that's because you can do it, but it's incredibly expensive, right? And incredibly time consuming. And it's not something that most academics, or any academic singularly, and any academic without some really major funding could pull off. And now you have people running surveys that, you know, run in a few months, you know, and they've collected data that would have taken decades to collect earlier. And so the big advantage of this computational sociolinguistics approach is that we get lots and lots of data, and either from surveys or from natural language corpora. And this really is important. It's important for two big reasons. I think, you know, I'm going to really focus in on these large corpora today, of course. And these sort of two big reasons, or the two big reasons that are kind of mostly discussed, is on the one hand, for sociolinguistic research, you're trying to kind of correlate linguistic variation to extra linguistic variation, right? To see how language structure varies along with social structure. And so you get these two big advantages when you have lots of data, right? The one is that you can look at these extra linguistic variables in really high resolution, especially with geolocated data across space, but also if you're using social media data, just like the actual network itself is a lot of social information, like who's responding to who, who's following who, etc. And then time, because you get this really fine-grained time data as well. So on the one end, you get this really able to do really high resolution and look at really complex patterns across these extra linguistic variables that we care about. And then on the other hand, you can zoom in on these really, it really opens up the potential to look at a lot of different linguistic features, including very rare features. I mean, a big problem with say a collection of sociolinguistic interviews, or even a collection of like a traditional corpus like the BNC or something, is that these aren't big enough to look at most lexical and grammatical features of interest, right? That's the big reason why we don't look at lexis and grammatical variation in variation of sociolinguistics, is that the data sets don't really allow it. You can do a survey, of course, and then you can ask any question you like, but you can only ask so many questions, and you have to know the questions ahead of time. And so these two things, right, being able to look at extra linguistic variables in a lot of detail on the one hand, and really complex, and look at the interaction of a lot of extra linguistic variables at once if you want. So this all requires really highly stratified corpora. That's possible with big data. And then on the other hand, you can look at really rare linguistic forms because you have lots of data. And so I think it's just a kind of a way of really getting a more complete perspective on language variation and change. Generally, this is all based on social media data, but as opposed to kind of CMC research, where the goal is really to look at social media data or to understand, say, internet communication, I think often in computational sociolinguistics, that's not the main goal. The main goal is to take advantage of this large amount of data, although there's obviously a lot of overlap there as well. Okay, so today what I want to talk about is this research I'm doing with Cameron Morin, which is in review right now. We've just submitted revisions. And this is something I think that really does a great job of showing off both of these real advantages to working with these really large corpora for studying language internal variation and change. And so the feature I want to look at is double modals, which are basically sequences of two modal verbs in a row. I'll give you some examples in a second. And this is, of course, or well, maybe not. I mean, maybe this isn't obvious to everyone, but these are very rare constructions in the English language, and they're quite elusive. They're quite controversial. Jeff Pullum, for example, has questioned if they even exist, that they're so rare. There's a lot of controversy around their grammatical analysis. And this is something that, you know, like traditionally you just couldn't look at in like a sociolinguistic interview, or even in like a, you know, like a 30, 50, 100 million word corpora. They're just not common enough. They also are very informal. So you also need informal language data to study them, which, you know, social media does provide. And so on the one hand, you end up with this really, you know, this is a great example, I think, of showing how you can work with really rare features using these corpora, which has like been a traditional critique of corpus linguistics, right? This is a standard formal linguistic kind of critique of corpus linguistics, is that you cannot look at rare features. Like you don't, you know, you can only look at pretty common features. And something like double modal would be like a prototypical challenge for that kind of, or a prototypical example for that kind of critique of corpus linguistics, right? It's just not common enough. Well, you get really large corpora, and it is common enough. And what we'll show is that when you have these really large corpora and you actually look what's really happening with these really rare features, you find out that not only is it common enough to look at it, but it then forces you to reassess all these assumptions and to question the findings that have been made based on intuition, based on grammaticality tasks, things like that. So that's the idea here. And then the other way that it's very useful, or the other way it kind of shows off what we can do with these big corpora is that we're doing really high resolution spatial analysis here. So the extra linguistic variable of focus here is regional variation and double modal use, and we can really zoom in and give you high resolution pictures of how double modals are used on Twitter in this case, using this data set in a really high resolution that hasn't been possible before. So these are the two kind of descriptive goals. One is to basically say, well, what double modals are out there, and like really what is the kind of inventory and the double modal system that's possible in American English, and then to map their usage in high resolution. And then what we do in the paper is we consider the relevance of these results to quite a wide range of theoretical debates. But I'm going to focus in on the ones that are most interesting to me here, which is on dialect variation and the origins of double modals. So I'm going to talk about that today. We also talk a lot about in the paper about the sort of semantics and kind of combinatorial properties of these things, but that's not really my main interest here. Okay, so here are some double modals for you in case you don't know what they look like. These are all from the corpus. I'll tell you a bit about the corpus in a second. But these are the things in bold here. So these are these sequences of two modal verbs in the same tense clause, right? So shit might could get real on Friday. I might can just come and scoop you. We'll see though. The Spurs will should win in 5 against the Grizz. But I might accidentally flirt with her. And even if you don't have double modals in your own dialect, even if you haven't really heard them before, which is quite possible, right? I mean, they're very rare, as I say, and most of us don't use them regularly at all, or even encounter them. I think these are all fairly easy to parse, right, or to kind of extract their meaning. They might be difficult to parse according to standard theory, but we can figure out what they mean at least. So shit maybe could get real. Often you can just replace the first one with an adverb. I maybe can just come and scoop you up. The Spurs will likely should win, you might say there, right? Okay, so usually there's some kind of like adverbial meaning being kind of tacked on, and that's kind of the idea here. Okay, but these are examples from the corpus. Because they're so rare, as in in the literature, until recently, there's been a couple of these papers that are using bigger data to look at them. There's a recent paper by Coates in 2022 in American Speech, which looks at them too. But until these recent studies that have been drawing up big corpora, I think all the double modal, or almost all the double modal examples for American English have been collected into Multimo, which is a kind of a database of double modal attestations out of University of South Carolina. And there's about 5,000 in there total. So that's like the universe of sort of observed tokens in sociolinguistics, in linguistics in general. And a lot of those are just kind of they're not all collected, like almost none of them are collected in just sort of natural language use, right? They're things collected in contrived circumstances, in sociolinguistic interviews, and various types of surveys, and so so it's not a great database for certain questions, like say, what is the relative frequency of these different modals? What is the full range of modals that's been attested? I mean, it's not, or that exists, I should say. And so this is pretty limited, and this is what we kind of know, or what we think we know. So one we know, you probably heard this before, that might could is the most common double modal. You saw there was an example there. It's also generally thought that there's a pretty small number of additional modals. There's kind of disagreement on what's possible and how big the inventory is, but usually thought to be around 30 or so max. Double modals are known to be especially common in Southern English, so in the southern part of the United States, in the old Confederacy part. They're thought to be most common in Appalachian English, so up in the Appalachian Mountains, which is kind of like a relic area, and that's because the view is that is evidence of, and this is because these come from Scotch Irish. So basically, you do have double modals in Scotland, not that much in Northern Ireland these days, but they're in the border regions of Scotland. Those people moved to Ireland, and then these Scotch Irish settlers came over to the US somewhat later than, say, British and other German settlers and stuff, and they come down and kind of fill in the Appalachian Mountains. And this is supposed to be kind of the heartland, if you like, or the hub for double modal usage in the US. So this is what we know about them, and what we really set out to do here was to kind of just is try to give a more of an empirical basis for this and really say, look, we don't really know though, like what is the full inventory or what is the frequency of these double modals. So we don't really have that information. And then on the other hand, we also don't really, like we don't really map them in detail. Like, you know, there've been studies in various parts of the United States, but just because there's been lots of studies in Appalachia where they look at double modals doesn't mean that double modals are particularly common in Appalachia. That seems to be the assumption. But the evidence of lots of studies in a particular area of a country isn't evidence itself that the feature that they're looking at is particularly localized, right? That's often the justification, but it's not the evidence. That's sort of been assumed, or maybe it hasn't been assumed by the researchers themselves, but in the wider picture, it's been seen that double modals are especially common in this area. Okay, so here's the method. I'm not going to do much on the method, and the method itself is pretty simple. I mean, at least until we get to the very end. There's a little bit of sort of fancy statistics at the end, but you know, I think this is one of the kind of great advantages of having all this data, right? Like when you have tons and tons of data, you know, you don't need to do tons and tons of like fancy statistics. You can just observe the data. I mean, it's a lot of work to process and collect and organize that data. But the actual analysis itself can be very basic and very kind of descriptive and exploratory. You know, there's not a clear other approach that could do the things we are going to show you today. I think this is the only way of doing it right now. The corpus contains 9 billion words, so it's huge. It's a really big corpus. It must be one of the bigger, it must be the biggest geolocated corpus that's being used, at least in academic research right now, I think, or one of the biggest. It's about 1 billion tweets, and it's just all from 2013 to 2014. This is the data that we've used in a number of studies that Yannis mentioned in the introduction, and this was really kind of the heyday of getting Twitter data. After 2015, they made it so that if you want to geolocate yourself, or sorry, they made it that you had to choose to geolocate yourself, basically. So up until about 2015, if you were posting from a smartphone, your longitude and latitude was recorded in great detail, like down to the meter. It got a little bit, the precision went down a little bit in 2014, but still, you know, like within a few blocks of where you were, for example. After 2015, they made it so you would have to opt in. So if you wanted your geolocation to be collected, you'd have to go into the settings and turn it on, whereas previously you had to turn it off, and that then caused just a real plummet in the amount of data that was available. So that's why this sort of, you might see a lot of this research coming from that era, because that was kind of when you could get the most data the easiest. Maybe not the easiest, but sorry, where you could get the most geolocated data quickly. So all these have the long and lat on them, and that then means that we can sort them, and we can basically stratify the corpus into this really high resolution regional corpus. So all we do here is you take all the tweets and we sort them by county based on the longitude and latitude, and then we end up with about 3,000 like subcorpora. Each one is a county. Each one's associated with a part of the map. Each one's associated with a centroid that we can work with. I think it's important to note here that like one person's tweets could be in multiple counties. I mean, of course, most people aren't. Most people spend most of their time in their own county, and you know, when they travel to other counties, it's a very small percentage of their total tweets. In fact, you know, early on in the project, we tried resolving this, and we could basically figure out where anyone lives. In the larger project, we could pretty much figure out where someone's home was, right? Because you can look at their long lats and figure out, you know, well, here's where they are every evening, basically. We found that made no difference, and we thought it's better just to work with the tweets where they fall, because that's kind of a synchronic view of regional variation. Okay, so what we did then is we took this big corpus and we just pulled out all possible sequences, all possible double modals, at least, you know, kind of as relatively narrowly defined. We looked at 11 different modals, and we looked for all sequences of 2 modals in a row, right? So any sequence that had 2 modals in a row, we would pull out. It doesn't catch everything in the sense that, you know, you can have an adverb splitting the double modal. We also excluded things where it was the same modal reduplicated. So like I might, we got rid of those. And so what that gives you is 110 possible combinations of double modals. So we looked for all of those, and that pulled out 10,000 tokens out of the corpus, but we then hand checked these all 10,000 of them, and about half of them were false positives. So these are things like, you know, my friend Will can go to the store. You know, that's Will as a noun with can, or I will can you, where the comma was missing. Okay, so you can see how that would pop up on Twitter quite a bit, where like, you know, where the punctuation's missing. So those are the kind of ones we'd find mostly. So either where, you know, one of the words, I mean, of course, all of these modals, or most of them, have other, you know, they're essentially polysemous, right? So you have will, can, those can be nouns. Might can be a noun, for example, right? So most of them can do this kind of stuff. May can be a month. Okay, so there was that problem. And then the other problem was clause boundaries, right? So where they're actually not in the same clause, you would probably put a full stop or a comma in formal writing, but on Twitter, you don't bother. Also, some things that just look like typos and stuff like that too, right? So anyways, that got us down to 5,000 plus tokens of double modals, which, like I said, it's more than what was in the whole multimodal database. So this whole history of multimodal research in this Twitter corpus, we get more tokens than have ever been observed recorded in the history of the field. And this is I mean, that's not so surprising. We were expecting to find a lot, right? I mean, we have 9 billion words of highly informal language from everyday people. But what we weren't expecting to find was 76 double modal types. So what that means is there are 76 distinct combinations of two modals that occurred at least once. And that is super surprising, right? Like that really, you know, wasn't expected, because like I said, you know, there's been a lot of debate on how many double modals are possible. And we're often talking kind of in the 20 to 30 range. And because a lot of theory is based in grammatical theory is based on the idea that only certain combinations are possible. And what I think, if we get 76 out of 110 possible double modals out of 9 billion words, I mean, I think basically if we had, you know, 100 billion words, we'd eventually get all 110 of them. I mean, I think it's every one of them is possible, and it's a productive process. I'll come back to that in a moment. I think that's one of the more exciting results. But just this basic descriptive result that there are 72 double modal types attested here, hand checked. You know, maybe a couple of the, you know, a number of them only occur once or something, right? So maybe a couple of those are kind of typos or something, but we're still talking well over 50, well over probably 60 or 70 with any, you know, by any, even if we were super conservative, and we were actually very conservative in the hand checking here. So then what we did was, for each of these 76 double modals, we then measured the relative frequency of that double modal in each of the counties. So, you know, imagine a kind of a sub part of the corpus is all the tweets from one county, which let's say is, I don't know, 1 million words of tweets. And then let's say there's 10 double modal, 10 tokens of might could. Then in that county, we would say, well, might could occurs once every 100,000 words, right? So we would normalize like that. So in that way, we can, you know, just this kind of standard corpus linguistics way, just so we make sure that we're controlling for the fact that, of course, each of these counties has very different amounts of data in them. Although almost all of them have very substantial amounts of data. It's got good coverage. Okay, so here's the kind of distribution of the 76 double modals. And this is maybe even more surprising than that we found 76 types, and that is what the first type is. So the first type, the most common by a long shot, right, almost twice as common as the second one over here, is might can. So it's not might could. Might, I mean, the one thing that everyone who does double modal research agrees upon is that might could is the most common one. It is the prototypical double modal. It's the one that is always discussed first. And it's not even close to the most common one. Like might can is just running away with it, right? Might can you might not even see in many in much I mean, it isn't like one that isn't on the radar, but it's not one that's always discussed. You might sometimes see people discuss a limited set, and might can's not even in there. It's certainly never been reported as the most common, and so this is very surprising. And you can see it's not just almost the most common, it's really the most common. Look, it's not totally clear why this is. It might be a bit of a register effect, right? And it might be about social variation and how social variation plays out on this register compared to the data that was collected before. But of course, the data that was collected before was collected in all these really contrived situations and was collected from informants. And so what exactly that data represents is really unclear. Like, if most of the research has been in Appalachia, and then you have tons and tons of examples of might could, but might coulds really common in Appalachia, then that doesn't necessarily mean it's most common in American English in general. So I'm not sure that this would generalize to American English in general. I mean, as a corpus linguist, I don't expect it to necessarily, right? Like, this is all about Twitter, which is what we're talking about. But I do think it's remarkable that that the first time anyone's really done, one of the first times, at least the first time back when this research was first presented, that we found such a stark difference between might can and might could, and just how common might can is. It's very surprising, and I'm going to come back and explain why that is the case later on. But this is the distribution, and what you can see is that there's a few that are very common, and then we get this long tail, including a bunch of singletons here at the end. And this is, I think, to be expected, right? It's not a unusual distribution for a bunch of types from one domain in linguistics, right? But there they are. And my view here, or our view, is that, this doesn't reach all the way to 110 only because we don't have more data. I mean, I don't think there's any doubt that with more data, all of them would be seen eventually. Here's a little word cloud, but just to kind of highlight there how common might can is, might could. And you see some of these other ones here better, maybe like should would, may can, might would, used to could, which is a well-known one. Okay, so these are that's kind of the universe there. But you see we get all sorts of stuff, right? And they're all in there almost, or the majority of possible double modals are attested in the corpus. I'm not going to spend much time on this. This is the kind of thing we go into a lot more detail in on the paper. We really look at like what are the combinatorial properties of these, what modals tend to go in first position, what go in second position, which ones are related, what this tells us about their meaning, about their semantics. So this isn't something I'm going to talk about at all today, but this is a picture here of sort of just looking at which double modals are most, or which modals are most involved in these constructions, and how they pattern with both the first and second modals, right? So you can see here, for example, that in second position, you often get can and could, and in first position, you might get, things like will and might and stuff more often. And then you get some that are very rare, and this doesn't quite match onto their frequency, like of the modals in general, but obviously something like shall and ought to and used to are relatively uncommon, and words like might and can and could and would and will are pretty common modals, but it's not quite that, and so it's a bit more complicated than that. Okay, so what we then did was map them, like I said, and this is what I want to kind of focus on for the rest of this talk is the mapping, and then what we can what we can learn, or what we can infer, or how we can kind of consider previous research in light of these maps, and what they tell us in particular about dialect variation and the origins of double modals in American English. So here's a map of all double modals in America in our corpus. So this is if this basically the relative frequency of any double modal in each of these counties, right? So taking all the double modals together and then computing an overall relative frequency. And so you can see here that this is the South. I mean, this is exactly what we talk about when we say the South. If you can see my cursor here, so these areas in higher yellow. So these are the Carolinas. So that's Virginia where it starts. These are the Carolinas. Here is the Deep South, we might call it. So this would be South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama and Mississippi. Here's Louisiana. Here's East Texas and Florida down here. And then this is what we call the Upper South up here, where you see notably less. Okay, big cities here just to help people get oriented. I probably should have put them on, but New York City's up here. Okay, Los Angeles is over here, and then like this is Texas. So here's Dallas. Here's Atlanta, right here in Georgia. Okay. Miami's down here, New Orleans is here. Okay, so that's kind of the picture, and we're going to be looking at these maps quite a bit now and zooming in on the South momentarily. So anyway, this just shows basically, I think, kind of two basic things. One, it shows that these are concentrated in the South, as we know, and the other kind of big point here is that although they're concentrated in the South, we actually see quite a few of them in other places, right? I mean, especially up here in the Midwest. And in the Northeast, you see quite a few, right? I mean, they're actually used fairly often in other parts of the US. I mean, none of these are used very often, but, relatively speaking, more often than we might expect. I'm going to kind of look into that in more detail now. So here's a few of the ones that are most common. So here's might can, which is most common. And if you think back to that histogram I showed, I mean, it's really most common, right? Like might can and might could. Here's might could. These are the two most common by a long shot, right? And yet, if you look at these two, I think what you notice right away is that like these have a much more of a southern distribution, right? Like these are really in the South. It's a little surprising that if the two most common, which account for like 90% or something, I don't know the exact number, but like a very substantial amount of the double modals in the corpus are accounted for by these two, and yet these two have a much more of a southern distribution than the overall map does. And so that's the thing we kind of want to look into in a bit more detail here. So here's might can though with this southern distribution. Here's might could, and then if you think back to that histogram, we had a real drop off there. So these maps get a lot sparser as we go. Here's may can, but even a more clear southern distribution. And here's might would. Okay, another one that has a very clear southern distribution. Although you might notice here that the distributions are, arguably somewhat different. And we're going to zoom in on that in a second. Okay, but here's the surprising result, right? So like I said, we find these ones that are in the South. We see overall most of these occur in the South. And that's especially not surprising when you consider that the two most common are so much more common, and these occur almost exclusively in the South. But then what's happening? Like, how do we get these other ones across the rest of the US. If May-Can if May-Can's the fourth most common double modal and it's so isolated, largely to the south, like how do we get that broader map? Well, this is how we get it. And we get, sorry, that's might would. This is how we get it. We get it with things like should would. So here's the map for should would. And you can see no southern distribution on this. It looks kind of like a random distribution, actually, right? So it's just kind of spread out across the United States. It doesn't really look like much of a pattern there at all. There's clearly no kind of strong southern pattern there. Look at Mississippi, for example, doesn't have a single token. Here's another one. And these are the 5th and 6th most common in the corpus. Here's would could. So very similar again, right? Kind of random looking. Not much of a regional pattern. To me, that's super surprising. It's not surprising that one that has a southern distribution would have a few outliers, right? Like that's kind of makes sense. That could be people who are from there, who have traveled up there, someone who lived there. I mean, this is Chicago, so the idea that some southerner lives in Chicago and says might could isn't surprising, or Los Angeles, if you like, right? I mean, that's not surprising, but it's surprising when you look at should would and there's no southern signal here at all, right? Like it occurs a bit in the south, but as much as it occurs in the Midwest or the West or something. Same thing with would could. So what's happening here? Well, I think we have these two types of double modals, or we know we have from a geographical perspective on Twitter these two types of double modals. Most of our double modals of the 76 are what we call non-traditional double modals. These are ones that people have not observed before for the most part. These are ones that are very rare, and these are crucially ones that do not have a southern pattern on them. Okay, these are ones that do not show a clear southern pattern. Now, some of these are so infrequent that you wouldn't know, right? I mean, if there's 2 tokens in the entire corpus of, will ought to, then you can't really figure out where it's concentrated. But a number of them you can, like the ones I showed, and and then there's a number of others that just don't have regional patterns at all. And these are the 60 that don't. And so these are what we're calling non-traditional. Most of them are not established, they're not attested in multimo. And like I said, they don't have this southern pattern we would expect. Here they all are together. So this is a summary. So just like that first one I showed, right, that first map where it was all the data, here are just these non-southern modals mapped together. And when you put it all together, like even if you're worried that part of the problem here is we have just like low numbers on these, then you'd expect, well, we take them all together and then some southern pattern or some kind of pattern would pop up. And I don't think there's really any pattern here by my estimation. Here are some examples. So just to show that these things, which have not been attested, and hopefully I've never seen an example of these, that they all seem perfectly fine and seem to make sense. So, that LG G Flex might be my next phone. I used to would do anything to feel love, but now I'll do anything for y'all not to even be cordial. I used to really tick you off then. My attitude used to be awful. If you didn't have to sell your soul, I would join a club. These seem all valid to me. This last one here could be a maybe that was mistyped, right? Like that's possible, but I don't know. It seems just as valid as any other one, and I don't think there's an easy way out of the rest of these. And in general, like this is the kind of thing we would keep in. This is a good example of kind of how we would judge that. Like we took that as a valid one. But in general, this is what they look like. And they don't seem to be problematic, and they seem to be quite interpretable, but they're just not common ones that people have noticed before. And then here are the traditional ones. So there's only actually 16 of these that show clear. So, and when I say traditional, I mean ones that show southern patterns. There's only 16 in our data set that show anything like a southern pattern. And we're being pretty liberal here. So, we're trying to push as much as we can to this traditional. So even if it's very infrequent, but it's mostly in the south, we would count it here. But there's only 16 of these. And so we see this weird dichotomy that I don't think anyone's ever seen before. And that is we have the traditional double modals on one hand that everyone's been studying, but then American English has all these other double modals that just seem to be popping up at random across the US. And I think this is evidence of them being used productively. I think double modals in general are licensed in American English. They're probably licensed in English in general. This is my suspicion. And they get used productively, just extremely infrequently, right? Like there's this view that productivity needs to be frequent, but there's no reason to think that, right? Like we can have, we can productively create language at least theoretically, that's very infrequent. And I think that is what's happening here. And I think what we have then is this traditional system, which is like a codified double modal system that's taken advantage of this potential and really built something. But that the kind of potential is there in general. And I think, this is maybe not good evidence at all, and not the kind of evidence I like. But like as someone who grew up never hearing a double modal and who doesn't never used a double modal, and actually maybe never heard one in the wild in my life. I mean, maybe online and stuff, but never like in person. After you study double modals for 6 months, like you can say double modals. Like I say double modals without any trouble now, and I read them and don't even blink. I think there's like the potential there for double modals, despite the fact that they seem to violate this like one tense verb in a clause rule, which is very important in English grammar. Here are the traditional double modals mapped on their own, and you can see now that kind of cleans up the data a little bit. Okay, so what I want to do now is just sort of talk through that a little bit more, and then I want to zoom in on the traditional ones. So like I say, we find these two types, these traditional and these non-traditional ones. And so we think this is evidence of productivity, like I said. But what we can also do now is kind of isolate the traditional ones and really zoom in and see what's happening in the South now, and see what we can learn about dialect variation on the one hand, and about their origins on the other. I think maybe one more thing to say here that's kind of important is just like most of those non-traditional ones are very infrequent, and so there's only so much we can do with them. We can map them, we can sort of assess, at least for the more frequent ones, if they're kind of random or if they have a southern distribution. But at some point, when you're down to 5 tokens, you can't really do much with it. Whereas with these traditional ones, they're still very, very infrequent, relatively speaking, but I mean, relatively to other grammatical constructions, but they're frequent enough in this huge corpus that we can zoom in on them and get a bit more information out of them. So that's what I want to do now. So here now we're just going to try to zoom in just on the South, okay? So just again to get us all located, this is the Deep South. Here's Texas, here's Dallas, Houston, New Orleans, Miami, Atlanta is right here. This is Alabama and Mississippi. This is Tennessee. These are the Carolinas. Charlotte's about here. Charleston's over here. This is Virginia. Here's Washington, D.C. up here. Philadelphia is up here. And then this is West Virginia, and West Virginia, Kentucky, and Tennessee. This is the traditional kind of southern United States, say as defined by the Census Bureau, also as identified as a dialect region repeatedly. Okay, so here's Mike Can. This is the distribution on Mike Can, the most common. You can see it's used quite widely across the region, but especially here in the Deep South, right? Okay, so through these, not up here in the Upper South, not in Appalachia, Kentucky, and Tennessee especially, but more in the Carolinas, and then through the central part of the Deep South, the main Deep South states, which is Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi, and then into Louisiana and Texas. Okay, here then is Mike Could, and it's a somewhat different distribution. I would say Mike Could is somewhat more push north, okay, into the Upper South. It's still very common in the Deep South, but it shows a somewhat different distribution, a bit more pushed up, especially like into Tennessee here, you'll see. Okay, here's Mike Wood. And again, once we start looking at these less frequent ones, you can see it kind of naturally contracts a bit. And then here's Muscand, okay? Okay, so what do we see here? Well, I think the big thing we see here is that on social media, at least on Twitter, at least in 2014, that they mostly occur in the Deep South. Now, that is super surprising, I think, because as I pointed out, the whole assumption has been that they're really common in the Upper South, and especially in Appalachia. Well, I'm going to go back to this map here. Like this is, I'll go back to the general map. Like this is Appalachia here. Here it is, West Virginia. Here's Kentucky. These are the Appalachian Mountains. You can kind of see the border here. Now, there isn't so much data in there, but, there's not much data in here either, right? These are very rural counties in the Deep South, and these are rural counties. You just don't see much there. So I'm not saying they don't occur in Appalachia, and they might just occur more in other registers, let's say, but I think it is very surprising to see so few here in Appalachia. In fact, that might be the single most surprising result of this whole study, is that they're not as common where we thought they were going to be common, and they're really common in the Deep South, okay? So what does that mean? Well, I think what it means is, the Deep South, the main kind of demographic difference between the Deep South and Appalachia and the Upper South in general is that the Deep South is where African Americans live in much larger population, and that's because the Deep South is where they had plantations, right? And so there's a long history of African Americans, a really awful history of African Americans in that region. And so that's the big difference between the Deep South and the Upper South. That's the big difference from like a demographic perspective. And the whole idea of the theory of the origins of double modals is that they came from Appalachia, from Scotch Irish, who weren't generally slaveholders and who were poor and who lived in Appalachia and were later immigrants. It's hard maybe to see that. I'm going to come back to that point in a second. The other thing I want to point out, though, is that we can really kind of test this theory now that these are really strongly associated with African Americans. It appears to be so, right? Like it appears if they're in the Deep South, not in the Upper South, that there's some kind of African American signal here. But we can go a little bit farther, and what we can do now is try to do some analysis here and correlate the population percentage of each of these southern counties. So I don't know, there's say 1,500 southern counties or something, And we can then go in from the census and figure out what percentage of each of these counties is African-American, and then correlate that against the frequency of use of double modals and see if there's any relationship between African-American population in a county and the amount of double modals that we see on Twitter. So here is African-American population, and you can see exactly what I'm talking about, right? Like, so there it is in the middle of the country. That's sometimes called the Black Belt. And it's not just called
wait a little bit.
It's so rich there, they would put plantation. Right? Sorry, so you can see up here in Appalachia where we have like, this is the Appalachian Mountains here. You can see them, right? And then you can see up in this area very few African Americans. So what we did now is just see if we can correlate these two. So what we have here in yellow is the Mike Can hotspot. So there's a bit of stats here. I'm going to skip over it, but we do some hotspot testing. So we can produce these maps kind of showing where these different double modals really hotspot. And then we overlap them with African-American population over 20%. And you can see here that Mike Can, in this kind of lighter blue, overlaps a lot. You can see that the distribution of African-Americans overlaps with Mike Can usage. And we can see that it's less so for Mike Could, or here's Muscan. Again, very strong, right? Most of this light blue. It's maybe a little hard to see, but most of the yellow is in this kind of band here. Okay, that's why it's kind of this lighter blue. The dark blue is where there's not high African-American population. The yellow is where there's the dark blue is where there's high African-American population, but not much double modal usage. The yellow is where there's high double modal usage, but not much African-American population. And then this kind of this lighter overlap color, kind of greenish pale blue, that's where there's overlap. And you can see that these two overlap quite strongly. But then when you look at Mike Wood, you see it's less, right? You see a lot more yellow outside that region. Here's Mike Could now. Okay, so this is the one that everyone's thought was the most common, and you see it's quite a bit outside the area. And then here's Mike Should, right? Like largely outside that area, right? And here's the most, Might Ought To. It's almost all outside the area. There's very little in the African-American concentrated area. So, or relatively little, I should say. So what else can we do? Well, we can actually correlate these values, like I said, and we can rank each of these double modals by how strong the correlation is to areas with high African-American populations. And the main takeaway here is that all but one of these are the most common of the 16. After Might Ought To, there's probably too uncommon to really do this in a meaningful way. But what we see here is that there's like a pattern here. So there's some social meaning here, right? Like some of these have a stronger association with African-American English or African-American language. But all but one of them is more strongly associated with African-American language, right? So although we see some kind of continuum here, crucially, we see these all on the positive side almost. So on Twitter, double modals are being used mostly from people who originate from counties with really high African-American populations. And that's really surprising if you think that this is a white form that started in Appalachia when there's very few African-Americans in Appalachia. So I think that this is a really important result. We see that double modals are not just associated with the South, but they're associated with African-American areas. We also see that some are more associated than others, like Mike Can is very strongly, more so than Mike Could. I think this is why Mike Can's been underestimated, because so much of this field work is focused on white informants, right, in Appalachia and other places. So if you're excluding African-American informants or not representing them to the degree that they should be represented, then it looks like, of course, you would underestimate Mike Can, and of course, you would overestimate Mike Could, right? But when you're just getting data on the fly like that's exactly what might happen. Okay, so finally, I just want to wrap up. Then I'll take a few more minutes here. Sorry for running a bit late. But on the origins of double modals. So this is the standard theory, as I've said a few times. It's highly speculative because there is no historical record to draw upon. But the idea is that we know that the Scotch-Irish, and actually more so Scottish-English, has double modals. We know these people settled Appalachia, and there's been, and we know double modals do occur in Appalachia. So the idea is that Scotch-Irish settlers brought them, and then through contact, they spread out across the South. And that's the story. It's a bit of a tricky story because one, you need to somehow explain how the language features that were associated with this very isolated community of poor English speakers from the British Isles was able to get to African Americans and to very rich British people from British background who were the prestige speakers in the South, right? These are people from Southern England who don't have double modals, and yet they picked them up. And now after the fact, we see there's actually less up in Appalachia, and there's more in the South. It's not impossible, right? But it's a little tricky to explain. And so I think there's this alternative theory. So like this is all kind of hard to like, it's all pretty hard to reconcile those results with the standard theory. It's not impossible. I'm not saying it's definitely not true, but double modals are not most common in Appalachia. They're most common in the Deep South. They are most strongly associated with African American language on Twitter, not with white Upper South English. And like we also saw, they're actually used productively across all the United States, right? So now you're in a spot where you need to explain, I guess, how those spread out everywhere. Also, like I said, the inventory is much bigger. So we think our empirical results offer a stronger support for this alternative theory, which is also very speculative, but it's always ruled out, and it shouldn't be. It should be right at the top of the list. One, that they are generally licensed in American English and maybe in English in general. Two, that this traditional Southern system was taking advantage of this, but it was an African American innovation, perhaps related to Creolization. There are double modals in Creoles all over the place, and there's a long-standing debate about whether African American English was a Creole, whether it's kind of its own language, right? And then that double modals from there spread to other dialects of Southern American English, developing more complex social meaning over time. And I just want to point out that we have like countless examples of African American English spreading throughout America. I mean, it's not at all an uncommon pattern these days, at least. Okay. Okay, so here's what we thought we knew. And I think these are almost all wrong, right? So Mike Could is not the most common double modal, at least not on Twitter. It's Mike Can. There's not a small number of additional double modals. They're actually used productively. They're not especially, I mean, they are especially common in the South, but it's more complex than that. We both have variation between the South and the rest of the US, and then we have variation within the South. They're not especially common in Appalachian English. They're most common in the Deep South, and they might not originate from Scotch-Irish settlers. They might originate from African Americans. Okay, so then just to wrap up quickly, I just want to kind of zoom back out and just say quickly about big data and sociolinguistics. I made the two main points, right? And I think I illustrated both here, which is that, you know, they allow for both linguistic and social variation, those variables, to be analyzed in greater detail. But I think it's important, and it's kind of really only occurred to me as I got to the end of writing this talk, and that was that they also allow for this kind of open-ended analysis, like not just on the linguistic side. Obviously, corpora allow for open-ended analysis in a way that surveys don't. Like everyone knows that, right? It doesn't really matter how big the corpus is. It still allows for open-ended analysis in a way that surveys don't. But it also allows for the open-ended social analysis. So like you don't need to presuppose the social categories that you end up discussing. You can discover them. High-resolution social data, like in this case, all these counties, allows you to infer these latent social variables, to actually let the social groups emerge based on your analysis of language variation. I mean, this is, I think, a really important idea, and it's like what happened here. We didn't set out to look at African American English. We never isolated African American English. That was not the idea, right? The idea was just to see how they're being used. But because we have such high resolution, we can then go in and actually kind of figure out what are the social patterns that are happening here. And I think this really is important. I think it's kind of like a different approach to sociolinguistics. You know, what we can say is that we obviously have these like three waves of sociolinguistic research that have been talked about a lot. They've all kind of had more and more complex conception of social structure, right? So like first wave, really broad, big categories. Next wave, you're now looking at networks. The next wave, you're actually looking at these like very narrowly defined social categories. But what comes along with this, you know, recognition of the complexity of social structure is that because of the approaches to data collection, we must also narrow what we look at, because as we accept that social structure is more and more complex, if we're just going in and collecting a little bit of data, we have to take a very narrow, we have to have a really top-down picture of what kind of social patterns we're looking for. And what big corpus data lets you do is lets you get really detailed social patterns, but you don't have to presuppose them, just like you don't have to presuppose the linguistic features you want to look at. And I think this is a really important innovation. Thank you very much.
Right. Thank you so much, Jack, for this rich and fascinating and inspiring talk. And we have good 10 minutes for discussion, and I'm very happy to open the floor now to discussion. I see Christian Meyer. Yeah, please go on.
Yeah, thank you very much. I guess we all agree that your approach, your data are fascinating, and the approach has enormous potential, and it inspires all sorts of questions. And I have 3 points, one referring to the digital medium,
Yeah.
Now, considering that you can buy might could t-shirts and maybe even might can t-shirts, what about vernacular performance and registerment and people behaving differently on Twitter with at the high frequency end? That's the medium specific point. And then I have two minor grammatical points. If you include used to and ought to, why not go for the new contractions like you might gotta spend some time with me. I'm sure people talk like that. I mean, And then, of course, the monumental task, teasing apart deontic epistemic modality. You might can play the piano is a different kind of modality from you. That might can be dangerous. One medium-specific CMC point, two grammatical perspectives, and no monumental amount of work involved. But I guess that sooner or later, if you pursue that line of research, these two issues turn up. So thanks very much. So, really great. And
let me hit the first two questions, or the second two questions first. So yeah, you're right. So we looked at these 11 modals and semi-modals, but you're right. There's more we could look at there, and that was mainly just like you say because the task of hand checking is monumental. So that's really the problem, right? Like this is something that requires hand checking. I don't think, these are such rare features. I mean, these are such rare features that, you can't even expect like these large language models to get them, right? They're super rare. And so and there are lots of, like you saw, false positives and lots of reasons for false positives. And so that was the main reason there. It's something we'd like to look into in the future. And similarly, actually, Christian, one of the big ones is like, one of the big debates in grammar is which one is the real modal? Are they both real modals? Is one of them an adverb? Are these idioms, etc., things like that, or multi-word units? And the solution there is often to see where adverbs, like not in particular, what gets modified by what, right? And so there's actually all these other ones that we haven't looked at all, and there's triple modals too. Things like that. So those have all been left out, and that's just because, like you say, of the kind of it being a fairly daunting task. We have gone through and done coding on the different semantics of the different types of modals. So that's all reported in the paper, and that's something that if Cameron was here, he could talk about more than I do. But I'm not. That's not. I find those judgments really hard to make myself, if I'm being honest with you. But yeah. So we've done that, and what we see is that there have been certain assumptions made about what double modals are most, or what semantic patterns are most possible, and we find that those are there, but they're quantitative. So basically everything's possible, but certain combinations, mostly as predicted, are more common. The first question, sorry, what the first question was on?
It was in registerment. Performing the vernacular rather than using it.
No, it's a big one, right? So I think looking at most of the examples and looking at where they occur, I don't think most of them are in any way kind of inauthentic in a sense. Of course, you're in this register and you can't help but be in this register or whatever register you're in when you're communicating. So that must exert some force. And a great example here, right, to take a more familiar example is like, in most English corpus, the most common word by a long shot is the, right? But it's not on Twitter, it's I. And so right there, you see, like, that's not even about like any social expression of meaning really, or maybe it is a little bit, but more it's just about the kind of broader register impact there, and that people are more personal and more informal, and therefore some of these words become more common. And so, it very well might be that might can is not most common in some other register. But I think what's actually most likely is might can is more common here because there's a very big African-American representation on Twitter. It's over the representation of the population. It's not massively over. I think the population is like 18% African-American. I think on Twitter it's like 20%. So it's, it's not bad, but that 2% makes a difference, especially when previous studies were maybe at like 1%, right? So, that 15% more African-Americans might be what's driving this. And I think, I personally think this idea of like, what's the most common form in English in general or American English in general is kind of a meaningless or something that's pretty impossible to measure, right? Because of this register variation. So I think the best we can do is go into individual registers or into well-defined registers and tell you what's most frequent there. And then you can do this over and over again and you can see, but the problem of course is that you can't do this for any other register except Twitter right now, basically, right? And so I think that's the challenge. Although Stephen Coates did this with YouTube data, and he got Mike Can a lot higher than you'd expect, but he also had very bad coverage in the African-American parts of the US when you look at the overall map. And so I think that was also kind of somewhat biased against Mike Can. But yeah, I think that's the big one. I mean, I think there is some interesting stuff happening with social meaning there, and we're very interested in the idea of like what is the social meaning these express. And I think near the end I started talking about, well, some of these some of these ones maybe express more African-American social meaning. But you know, there are lots of interesting examples too. There are people making jokes using double modals for sure. I mean, there's like the one might shall example in the corpus is a famous hip hop producer who's making a joke about someone who just said might will, and they then say, well, might shall. You know what I mean? But so it's a joke, but it is a legitimate use. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
I'm having a question in the chat by Camila Vasquez, who's asking, I'm going to read this out for you, Camila, or would you like to put your question yourself? How would you wish? Let's read it out. Yeah. Is there a way of correlating the use of these double models that occur in high density in high density African American English areas with other African American English features in the particular Twitter users population? So look at co-occurrences. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a great point. So I mean, the idea here would be to take so rather than trying to establish this relationship, I guess, through correlation to this demographic data by census, but rather to use the corpus itself to do this. There's actually two ways of doing this. So the one would be to try to look at other linguistic features that we know are more strongly associated with African American language. I mean, in some sense, arguing here the double modals are especially is something of an original argument, right? So there's certainly other forms that we could, just lexical items, for example. So I think that's a really nice idea. And then the other one is that you can do social inference on individual accounts, right? So you could say like look at people's images and try to figure things out that way and get some kind of measure. I think that's a great idea, and it's something that we were kind of looking around at doing a bit, and we just never really got to, like, trying to find some other lexis. I think the problem though is that, like, you know, you still would have the problem of performative uses there, right? So I think you should probably still, like, that doesn't, because I mean, you'd have to find these other AAA features that weren't performative. If anything, presumably these double modals are the least performative ones of all, because these are the ones that people didn't really know were African American, right? So it's not like, you know, and if Mike can is something that's kind of under the radar of you know, what's on shirts, for example, which I think it is largely, then this isn't a performative one in some sense, or it's less obviously performative than Mike could. I mean, anyone who's joking around who lives in the North and knows anything about double modals will use Mike could as a joke. They won't use Mike can because it's not a well-known one. So I think it's actually probably pretty low in this kind of performative, but I think there are other ways of doing this. I do think that this very strong correlations across all these features on the geographical distribution, which is very clear in America. It's very, you know, it's quite segregated in that part of the US, is very, very strong evidence though. And I think I think it is sufficient, but I think there is more we could do with it. And I think it would be very interesting to do that. It would also be very interesting to look at more dialect variation within African American language in the South. I think that would be a really nice one.
Great, thank you. And let's take very quickly a request for clarification because we're running out of time. I have a question asking, are double modal patterns syntactically correct? I guess the question is, are they standard English? Probably not, right?
Yeah, I mean, this is my argument. My argument is that they are. I mean, they aren't standard English in the sense that, like, a prescriptive grammar wouldn't. You know, the New York Times would not let the reporter have a double modal in there. They've always been seen as being highly non-standard, and I think they're highly non-standard in the sense that they don't occur in more formal discourse usually. But this idea is I think the more interesting question is, are they like a very marginalized and isolated dialect feature? And that's always been the assumption, right? That they only occur in certain Southern speakers. And that's one of the main arguments I think here that we're trying to present, which is that no, I think they actually are generally licensed by American English. They're just not very common, right? Like, the meaning they need to express is very uncommon, and the idea of combining them is not a most obvious one, or the one that's most natural, or the one that's most easily generated. And I think what we find is that there actually are just possible in the English language. So I think they are actually something that is, grammatical, if you want to think of it that way, for any American English speaker. They're just not very familiar, and they're not very frequent. They're very infrequent. But I think it's a really interesting question. I think it's like, and the reason they're so controversial grammatically, right, is because English grammars do not handle having two tensed verbs in one clause. I mean, they're very hard to handle for formal grammars of English. They're very hard, and Cameron's very interested in modeling them in construction grammar. That's his dissertation.
Thank you so much once again for this talk. We're closing now because time's up. Thanks again.
You so much. Thank you so much.
And for those who are still in the room, I'm pasting into the chat the program for the first half of 2023. We're going to have 6 more DiLCo lectures in the first half, and hopefully another 6 in the second half of 2023, starting in January. But for the time being, thank you all for coming, and have a very nice Christmas and festive break, and hopefully see you again in January.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.